I can remember coming here in the 70s, 1970. I came to America. And when I came to America and I landed at the airport, John F. Kennedy Airport, and I remember I came in January 1971, it was. I have never been in such a cold place in my life. My experience was, it was just cold and just a very unhappy place was my first thought. Because I was coming from Jamaica, which was a warm island, very warm. I was 7 years old. I grew up on that island until I was 7. And was taken to America by my father. My father brought me here into America. And I just felt like I didn't want to be here when I came here. My life was happy in Jamaica as a child growing up. I remember happy times. When I was born, I had a midwife. Unlike going to the hospitals here and giving birth, my mother had a midwife that made sure that everything was okay with her. I was born properly. Everything was good with me. And growing up in the 60s in Jamaica, I can remember just good times. I would go to the river, bathe. If I wasn't bathing in the river, I was bathing out in the sun with a wash tub. We called it wash tubs at the time. So I would bathe from a wash tub in the sun as a kid in the open. That's how free we were. My grandmother, I can remember my grandmother. She was a white woman, and I always say this about my grandmother because she was white as hell. Years later, I found out that she was actually white, but growing up as a kid, either looked at her, she was white, never thought nothing of it, just one of those things. But I remember my grandmother used to buy milk, and we used to get milk in the crate, like 6 bottles, 3 bottles on each side. And she would wait on the guy who had a cow. Like, it wasn't always the same person. It was different people that had cows that was milking their cows, and you could get milk. So my grandmother would buy milk. She loved milk, so she would buy the 6 bottles every day, and she would make sure we had milk. Later on in life, I realized milk wasn't for me. Milk was supposed to be given to baby cows, baby calves, but that's a whole nother story about my eating habits, how it's changed over the years once you've learned how to eat differently. But anyway, we would get milk, and my grandmother would warm the milk, and you would get that buttery film on top. And that was like the greatest thing to me, because I could just take my hand and pick it up and put it in my mouth. I loved it. And she used milk to do all types of things. She was using milk to make Milo for us, which was a chocolate drink. She was doing all of that. And as a kid, I was going to school, and the school was attached to the church. You know, it was part of the church. So all they showed me was love. I had a lot of love because my grandmother was part of the church, and because my grandmother was a big part of this church. The school was the school that I went to, which was part of the church. All they did was show me love. It was all, everybody knew everybody, and everybody was, even though they weren't related, they were all friends. So I had a good childhood, a very, very good childhood. I could remember we lived on a hill, and the land went down on a slope, like downhill, and the water that surrounded the land belonged to us. The all the water that was there, because it was part of our land. And going down the slopes, I can remember I used to take cut the banana, not the banana, but the coconut tree limb. And I would sit in the middle of the open limb, and it was so slippery and slidey that my cousin I would sit in there, and she'd push me going down the hill. And the hill was just a grassy hill, and so it would just slide down the hill. And I would jump off right before I'm supposed to end up in the lake with all the rocks and everything that we had in the lake. It was so funny. But we were smart enough to know, okay, she's gonna push me down this hill, but I need to jump off of this, before I end up in the lake. All right. So I had fun like that as a kid growing up. And I had so much fun that by the time I made it to America in the 1970s, was 71, and realizing that all that fun was taken away from me because I couldn't go outside and play randomly anymore. There was no milk being delivered. There was no walking to the store to go get flour or sugar or anything of that sort. I now became locked away into an apartment in a building because I couldn't just randomly go outside. I couldn't randomly do anything anymore. No one knew me. This was like a strange new land for me. It was so strange that it was like, wow. As a kid, I'm looking around and I'm like, where am I? What's going on with me? My world has just changed overnight, like drastically. All right. So I had fun as a kid up until I was 7. So when I was 7 years old, I came to this country. And my thoughts on this country, like I said, I felt like I was swept away from this wonderful life like a nightmare it was, because my freedom was cut overnight. I couldn't go outside randomly. I couldn't go to the store. I just walked down to the store and everybody knew everybody. My school was different. My school wasn't part of the church, so no one cared. They couldn't give a rat's ass, you know. So here starts my new life. So I had to go to school. But because I was so sheltered when I was little, I didn't know my ABCs. I didn't know how to count from 1 to 100. I didn't know how to read. I didn't know how to write, because as a kid growing up, going to these little schools that was associated with the church, that everybody knew everybody and we were all related, not by blood, but just by association. I didn't have to learn how to read. I didn't have to learn how to write. I didn't have to learn how to do anything. I didn't know how to do anything. All I knew how to do was play and eat and be loved. That's it. That was my life. So when I came here, after the first week or two, and by the way, I came here, my father brought me here to this country. But by the time he brought me here, he was separated from his wife. So when I came here to my father, and my father alone. No woman in the house, just me and my father. My father had an apartment in Brooklyn. I remember it was right there on the corner of Schenectady and Utica Avenue. And the name of on the corner of Schenectady and, was it Troy or Utica? One of those. But the name of the apartment building was President Chateau. And I think it's still there to this day. That building is still there. Never forgot. And I lived all the way up. I think it was on the 5th or 6th floor. I'm not certain. But my window overlooked Schenectady Avenue, where I could look down into the street. So I think it was on the corner of Schenectady and Troy Avenue, called President Chateau. But Utica was to my right, which was further up, where you could catch the trains and everything. Utica Avenue had train stations. So I was stuck in an apartment building now with just me, myself, and I, because my father used to have to go out every day and work. And there was a lady in the apartment across from me. She was an older lady. And she was so disgusting. She chewed tobacco. I've never seen anyone when I was growing up chewing tobacco. So she would chew tobacco, and she had a can where she would spit in this can. She would chew the tobacco and spit in the can. And she kept the can close by, because as she chewed the tobacco, she had to spit. She was an American lady. And she was home all the time. And she had a phone, because back then phones were like limited. Only certain people would have phones. We had a phone too. But I remember my father having her watch me, because it was illegal for him to have, sorry about that. It was illegal for him to have a child that stayed by themselves at that age. So she lived on the same floor we did. She lived right across in the next apartment. So I would be in her apartment most of the time. But here it is. I'm still at home, not doing anything. My father realized at an early age, well, as soon as I came to America, that I didn't know how to read or write or do any of those things. I didn't even know my alphabet. I didn't know how to count to 1 to 100. I didn't know anything, because I didn't have to. Not only that, to be honest with you, I didn't even know my real name. Because growing up all my life, they call me Dar. D-A-R, Dar. That's all I knew. How I found out my right name, I'm sitting in the apartment one day, and I hear my father calling me by my name, but I didn't know it was my name. He kept calling, he kept calling, he kept calling, and I'm like, who's he calling? There's nobody in here but me. All of a sudden, he comes out of the room and comes into the living room, and he says to me, didn't you hear me calling you? I said, no, not really. I heard you calling somebody, but it wasn't me. He says, don't you know your name? I said, but my name is Dar. He said, no, that's not your name. That's your initials. Here's your name. And he started to tell me my name. And I was like, wow. You know, at that age, not only was I ripped away from my country, brought into this place, now I'm being renamed. This is all that's going on in my mind, because all my life, my mother and my grandmother and my friends and everybody I knew just called me Dar. That was my name. I didn't have another name. Okay, so that was the first shocker. Second shocker to him was when he realized I didn't know anything. So back then there was these books called Jack and Jill. So he decided to keep me home, start buying these Jack and Jill books, and these Jack and Jill books would teach me how to read, how to write, and he would get other books for me to do math. So my first year into this country, I really didn't go to school. I stayed home to learn how to read, to write, to do math. Finally, when he sent me to school, I went into my right grade because he had already beat me into submission to learn how to do math, to learn how to read, learn how to write, and just that 1 year, I learned everything that I needed to learn to be able to go to school now, to be in my right grade. But I didn't learn it per se on my own or out of love. I was beaten into submission to learn these things. Now, my father was one of the smartest people I've ever known. He was very intelligent. He was an ex-police officer from Jamaica. Came to this country, decided that he didn't want to go back. He came on a visiting visa. He was a police officer in Spanish Town back in the 60s, used to play in a police band, played music by ear. He could play the piano and the trombone by ear, so he ended up in a police band in Raytown, right? Came to this country on a visiting visa, loved it, decided he didn't want to go back, and stayed, and a year later, he got married to an American citizen. But when he came here, he left my mother pregnant with me. And my mother had me while he was in this country. So that's how I got here, because he filed for me after, brought me along by the time I was 7. Took him 7 years to get me here. All right. So he teaches me all this. And so finally now, I get a chance to go to school. I'm in the 2nd grade. One of the things that happened to me while I was in the 2nd grade, I used to get beat up a lot. Right, left, and center, I would get beat up all the time. They would just beat me because I didn't speak the language. I was still speaking in my native tongue, my dialect, which was patois. So I'm speaking in patois while I'm in school. I know the work. Half the time I wasn't understanding some of the stuff that they were trying to tell me to do. Not that I didn't understand English, because we grew up understanding English, but their way of doing stuff, I didn't understand. So not only was I getting beatings at home for learning how to read, write, do math, count, do all this crap, but I was getting beat up at school for speaking a whole nother language that these people didn't understand, or speaking in a dialect that they didn't understand. So by the time I made it to the third grade, after being in the second grade, I'm now in the third grade. Fast forward a year later now after that, I started to become a bully because I decided that I no longer wanted to be beaten. And if anybody was going to do the beatings, it was going to be me doing the beatings, not nobody beating me. So my first fight that I had was with a gal that was constantly bothering me. And because she was constantly bothering me in class, and she was the weakling, and she decided she was going to beat me every afternoon just to show how strong she was, because I was the only one not fighting back, and whatever. So this particular afternoon, I decided, okay, I've had it with the beatings from her. I'm going to be beating her. And I did beat her. And after that, it changed the whole scenario for me. So after I realized that I could beat her and that I shouldn't be afraid, I started beating everybody that I could. You understand? Started beating everybody that I could. But I was doing good in school. I was a good student. I was getting A's and B's. I was getting A's and B's. And I was going to PS 221 on Empire Boulevard. Getting A's and B's there. Being a good student. The only other problem I had at this point was I couldn't just randomly go outside, couldn't randomly go to the store, couldn't randomly do anything. So I was stuck in an apartment building, day in and day out, looking out a window, listening for when a train go by, because the train was underneath the ground and you could hear it when it was passing. So all these things. And so my childhood wasn't that great in New York. I wouldn't sit here and say that I had the best childhood. I went through a lot. And I want to share it with you guys little by little. And this is just my first episode of growing up in Jamaica, making it to the United States, and the first things that started happening to me that I couldn't understand or couldn't relate. But I want you to like, share, follow, comment. Tell me what was your first experience coming to the United States, because mine was of cold and desolate and just unhappy. Tell me if you had a different feeling.